The words reach me through the thin conference room wall before the meeting even ends. Honestly, my supervisor says with a dismissive laugh, she's replaceable. I stop walking. I am in the hallway with a stack of system reports in my arms, and the sentence lands so cleanly that it takes a second to make sure I heard it right. HR must be sitting across from him, because he keeps going. His voice is calm and casual, the voice of a man who believes he is simply stating a fact. She maintains the system, yes. But it basically runs itself at this point. Runs itself. 8 years of building that logistics system from a half-functioning mess into something the whole company depends on. 8 years of writing the procedures, fixing bugs nobody else understood, staying late when the network glitched, waking up early to run the morning checks before the first shift began. And Brian Keller is telling HR I'm expendable like a spare printer cartridge. I push the door open and walk in with a neutral expression. Brian turns and smiles like nothing just happened. Perfect timing, he says. I place the reports on the table. Inside my chest, something very quiet and very cold has settled into place. If he truly believes the system runs itself, he is about to find out exactly how wrong he is. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest. I did not sabotage anything. I did not delete files, corrupt databases, or take any action designed to cause the system to fail. I followed every procedure in my handover documentation. I answered every question asked during my final 2 weeks. I left the most comprehensive transition materials I had ever produced. What I stopped doing was the invisible work. The kind that does not show up in any procedure document because it is not a procedure, it is judgment. Experience. The habit of checking 3 things at once while watching for the 4th. The instinct developed over 8 years of knowing exactly how the system behaved under different conditions, which automated process had a tendency to drift under load, which combination of circumstances would cause a queue to back up in a way that looked routine until it wasn't. You cannot hand that over in a document. You can document the procedures. You cannot document the pattern recognition that makes those procedures work correctly. Brian did not know this. He had been told the system was fully automated. He chose to believe it because believing it was convenient. My supervisor told HR I was replaceable, then the system failed the next morning. My name is Danielle Mercer, and this is how it went. You need to understand what the system actually was before you can understand what it meant to lose the person watching it. The internal logistics system I managed handled everything that kept our operations moving daily. Inventory updates. Automated purchase orders when stock fell below threshold levels. Maintenance alert routing. Scheduling triggers that coordinated across 3 departments. When it worked, it was invisible. Orders processed automatically. Alerts fired at the right moment. Schedules held. When it didn't work, the entire operation stalled. Maintenance windows got missed. Inventory built up in the wrong locations. Teams waited on materials that should have arrived hours earlier. I had built most of the automation architecture myself, starting from a system that predated my hire by almost a decade and had accumulated years of legacy code that barely anyone still understood. I had written the calibration procedures, documented the failure modes, and designed the monitoring routines that caught problems before they cascaded. Brian Keller arrived 2 years before the hallway conversation and became my supervisor. He was sharp, ambitious, and entirely focused on what he could present to leadership. He was not focused on what I did every morning before the first shift began. That oversight was about to cost the company significantly more than my salary ever had. 8 years earlier, the system was a different thing entirely. When I joined, the logistics coordination process ran through a combination of an outdated proprietary platform and several department spreadsheets that were supposed to talk to each other but frequently did not. The result was constant. Duplicate orders, inventory mismatches, maintenance tasks that fell through the gaps, and a lot of overtime from employees doing the computer's job by hand when it got confused. My official title was Systems Operations Coordinator. My practical title, for the first 6 months, was the person trying to figure out why the inventory module keeps losing track of everything that comes in on Thursdays. It took 3 months to find that answer. The Thursday issue turned out to be a time zone handling error in the receiving module's timestamp logic that interacted badly with a scheduled overnight sync. It had been there for years. Nobody had traced it to its source because the symptoms looked different on different days. After I fixed the Thursday problem, I had a better understanding of the system's architecture than anyone else in the department. Possibly anyone else in the company. I started making a list of everything else that was slightly wrong. The list was long. I spent the next 2 years rebuilding the system piece by piece. Not all at once. A full replacement would have introduced risks worse than the existing problems. Instead, I worked methodically. I mapped every process, traced every data flow, identified every point where the automation made an assumption that did not always hold true. New automation rules replaced the oldest and most fragile logic. Error detection triggers went in at the highest risk points. Maintenance alerts were redesigned to fire earlier in the failure sequence, giving teams enough lead time to respond before a small problem became a work stoppage. The most important thing I built was the monitoring layer, a set of daily checks I ran manually every morning before the first shift started. Not because the automation couldn't check itself, but because the automation only knew what it had been told to look for. The monitoring layer looked for what the automation didn't know to worry about: trends, patterns, combinations of small signals that individually meant nothing but together were the early sign of something developing. This took about 45 minutes every morning. It was invisible to everyone except me. When I finished, I would get coffee and start the regular workday, and the system would run smoothly, and nobody thought about why. That is how invisible work functions. By the end of my second year, the chaos was mostly gone. Orders processed without duplication. Inventory balanced accurately. Maintenance windows were flagged far enough in advance to become routine rather than emergencies. Leadership praised the department's efficiency in quarterly reviews. My supervisor at the time mentioned it in an all-hands meeting as an example of smart operational management. He said the team had done excellent work. The team was 12 people. I was the one who had rebuilt the system. I noticed the gap and let it go, because I had learned early that correcting the record would have made me seem difficult rather than accurate, and being difficult came with costs I didn't want to pay. So I became the person who fixed things without being the person who fixed things, officially. What I did not fully understand then was what that invisibility would eventually cost me. Invisible work creates invisible value. And invisible value is very easy for someone like Brian Keller to look at and see nothing, because nothing is essentially what he had been told was there. He arrived confident, ambitious, and looking for things to cut. My invisible value was exactly what he found. Brian Keller became my direct supervisor about 2 years before the hallway conversation. He came from a different division where he had managed vendor contracts. He was articulate, presentable, good in meetings, confident in front of leadership, and skilled at making complex situations sound clean and manageable. He was also genuinely convinced that technology solved problems rather than that people solved problems using technology. This distinction matters more than it sounds. In his first month, he scheduled a process mapping session with me. He wanted to document the department's operations for a VP review. I walked him through everything: the architecture, the automation rules, the monitoring routines, the calibration schedule. He took detailed notes. At the end he thanked me and said he had a much better understanding of the system. What he had was a map. Maps and understanding are different things. The map told him, this system has extensive automation, daily monitoring, and calibration routines. The understanding would have told him, the daily monitoring is what makes the automation reliable, and the calibration routines are what keep it from drifting. He kept the map. He missed the understanding. And he took that map to leadership and described a system that basically ran itself. The first direct conversation where I understood what Brian was building came 4 months after his arrival. He had called me in to discuss operational efficiency, which I had learned meant he had already decided on something and wanted me to validate it. I've been looking at your daily monitoring schedule, he said. The manual checks every morning. Could those be automated or reduced in frequency? I explained that the checks weren't the issue. They took 45 minutes because they required judgment that automation couldn't replicate. The system ran automated diagnostics, but those checked for conditions the system already knew to look for. The morning checks looked for what the automation wasn't programmed to recognize. Brian nodded in the way that means someone has decided you are wrong and is waiting for you to stop talking. "The system seems to be running well," he said. "Maybe we're over-monitoring it." I submitted a written explanation afterward. I described 3 specific scenarios where the morning checks had caught developing problems before escalation. I included dates, log entries, and the estimated cost of the alternative, the failure that would have occurred if the problem had continued. Brian read the summary and said the system's track record suggested it was more resilient than I was giving it credit for. I saved my explanation. It would not be the last time I saved something. Over the following months, I documented everything with a care I had not applied before. Something in Brian's attitude had activated a professional instinct I had developed over 8 years of working with systems that failed when people stopped paying attention. The same pattern recognition I applied to the logistics software, I now applied to the situation around me. What I was recognizing was this: Brian was building a story. The story was that the department ran efficiently because of smart automation and good management. That story was not wrong exactly, the automation was well designed. But it was incomplete in a way that would matter if it was ever tested. I added a new habit to my morning routine. After the system checks, I spent 15 minutes writing a brief monitoring log entry. Date, what I checked, what I found, what I adjusted, time-stamped, stored in the shared drive, and backed up to a personal drive at home. I sent Brian a monthly summary of these logs. He replied to each one with variations of, "Thanks, sounds good." I kept the replies. I kept all of it. 8 years of building the system had taught me that the best time to prepare for a failure is before it happens. I was preparing. The rumor that Brian was pushing for a promotion had been circulating for about 6 months before the day I heard him through the wall. I had picked it up through ambient office information, half a sentence here, a knowing look there. The way promotions got built in our organization was familiar to me. You identified an efficiency to claim credit for. You reduced a cost that could be attributed to your leadership. You packaged it in language that sounded strategic. My position fit that template almost perfectly. Technical enough that executives reviewing Brian's proposal didn't have the context to evaluate it critically. Senior enough that eliminating it produced a meaningful number on a staffing cost line. Quiet enough, because the system ran smoothly, that no alarm bells would ring when the role was described as redundant. Brian needed something to point to. My salary was visible. My value was not. I kept doing the morning checks. I kept documenting everything. I went to every meeting and did the work that needed to be done. And I waited, because I had learned that in situations like this, patience was the only real defense available to someone without the organizational power to change what was already in motion. The day I heard Brian through the wall was a Tuesday in March. I had come in early to run the system checks and stopped by the break room for coffee before heading to my office. The conference room was on the way. The door was partially closed, which was why I could hear him but not clearly see inside. I heard the HR manager's name mentioned, which confirmed she was present. I stood in the hallway for maybe 30 seconds. Long enough to hear, replaceable. Long enough to hear, basically runs itself. Long enough to understand, with complete clarity, that the conversation I had been anticipating for months was happening on the other side of that wall. Then I pushed the door open and walked in. Brian's face showed nothing. That was actually impressive, practiced composure. The HR manager, a composed woman named Vera, looked at her notepad. I put the system reports on the table. I said good morning to both of them. I asked if they needed anything from me. Brian said they were just finishing up. I nodded and left. In the hallway, I took a breath. The morning checks were already done. The documentation from that morning was already saved. All that was left was to wait. Over the 2 weeks that followed, I documented with a precision I had never matched before. Every morning check, logged in full detail. Every calibration adjustment. There were 3 that week, minor corrections of the kind I made regularly, each small enough to be invisible and consequential enough to matter over time. Every alert that fired and what I did with it. I also began writing what I thought of privately as the complete manual, a document that went beyond the existing procedure guides to explain the reasoning behind each procedure. Not just what to do when the inventory module flagged a mismatch, but why the mismatch occurred, what it indicated about upstream conditions, and what questions to ask before accepting the automated resolution. A good procedure document tells you what to do. What I was writing tried to transfer understanding, the recognition patterns that couldn't be reduced to steps. I knew it would not fully succeed. Some things only transfer through experience. But I wanted to leave everything I could, because the situation was not the system's fault and it was not the fault of whoever would be trying to manage it after I left. It was Brian's fault. And Brian's fault was going to become obvious soon enough without any help from me. I delivered everything cleanly, professionally, and completely. HR scheduled the meeting 2 weeks after I heard Brian through the wall. I had expected it, but expecting something and experiencing it are different. Vera was professional and direct. Brian sat to her left in the same conference room. The role was being eliminated, she explained. As part of a broader cost review, the position had been assessed and determined to be redundant given the system's current level of automation. My final day would be in 2 weeks. Brian said something about the decision being difficult and the team missing my institutional knowledge. He said they had full confidence in the system's stability. I thanked them both. I asked clarifying questions about the severance timeline. I did not argue, the decision had been made and the room was a formality. What I was thinking about, while Vera described the departure process, was a specific log entry from 3 days earlier. A small drift in the overnight batch processing, nothing critical, corrected in 2 minutes during the morning check. Nobody else would know to look for that. Nobody else would know what to do when they found it. I signed the paperwork. I thanked them again. I went back to my desk and kept working. My last day arrived on a Thursday. I had spent the 2 weeks between the meeting and my departure doing the job as I always had, plus the additional documentation work, plus transition briefings with Vera and with the junior analyst being assigned to absorb some of my responsibilities. The analyst's name was Perry. He was 26, technically capable, and genuinely trying to understand the system as quickly as he could. I spent significant time with him. I walked him through the architecture, the monitoring routines, the calibration schedule. He asked good questions. He was not ready. 2 weeks was not enough time to become ready, and I think he knew it, though he was too professional to say so directly. Brian appeared briefly to thank me for everything I had done. He shook my hand. He said they were in good hands. He said the system was solid. I thanked him and kept my expression neutral. I had delivered everything. The procedure manuals, the monitoring logs going back 18 months, the calibration records, the written explanation of the overnight batch drift I had corrected 3 days earlier, flagged specifically as something to check during the first week without me. Brian had it all. Perry had it all. I drove home. I made dinner. And the next morning I woke up early, as I always did, out of 8 years of habit. The text arrived at 9:17 the next morning. It was from Perry. He said the inventory dashboard was showing unusual behavior and asked if I had a moment. I did not call back immediately. I made a second cup of coffee and thought carefully about my responsibilities. I was no longer an employee. I was no longer responsible for the system's operation. Perry had the documentation. IT had access to the technical records. I was also aware, in a way that felt sad rather than satisfying, that whatever was happening was probably the beginning of what I had been watching develop for 2 years. I texted Perry back. Check the overnight batch log from last night and compare it to the notes in the section I flagged at the end of the monitoring guide. IT should be able to find it. I did not tell him what he would find. I pointed him toward the documentation. Because the documentation existed, Brian had dismissed it. Vera had filed it. Perry had received a copy. The information was available. The question was whether anyone would use it correctly, whether the right person would be looking at the right information at the right moment with the right understanding of what it meant. That was the gap I had filled every morning. And it was the gap that was now open. Perry's second message arrived mid-afternoon. Fixed the batch issue, I think. But there's something in the scheduling queue that looks off. I sat with that message for a moment. The scheduling queue was connected to the batch processor through a dependency that required a specific sequence of steps to reset correctly. If Perry had fixed the batch issue without completing the dependency reset, the queue problem was not unrelated, it was a consequence of it. I sent him the specific section in the documentation describing the dependency reset procedure. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk. Because there was nothing else I was supposed to do. Perry had the documentation. The procedure was described in clear, specific language. Whether he found it in time, whether he understood it correctly, whether he had the contextual knowledge to apply it correctly, those things were no longer my responsibility. They had become Brian Keller's responsibility when he told HR I was replaceable. I walked for about 40 minutes. The day was cold and clear. I thought about the 8 years of morning checks, the 18 months of detailed monitoring logs, the complete manual I had written in those final 2 weeks. I had done everything I could do. The rest was already in motion. The third message came at 9:40 the following morning. This one was from a former colleague named Wesley, who worked in warehouse operations. He had heard there were logistics issues. Scheduling's been off since yesterday afternoon. Warehouse floor is waiting on material releases that should have gone out this morning. People are standing around. The scheduling delay Wesley was describing was the downstream consequence of the dependency reset that hadn't happened cleanly. The batch issue had cascaded into the queue issue, and the queue issue was now cascading into physical operations, the actual work of getting materials to the right places. This was the pattern I had described in writing to Brian on 3 separate occasions over 2 years. The point at which a small upstream calibration issue became a downstream operational delay. The point where the invisible system failure became visible because people were standing still waiting for it. I had flagged it. I had documented it. I had explained the connection between the morning checks and the prevention of this exact cascade. I did not respond to Wesley's message. He was informing me, not asking for help. The right place for that help was inside the building. I hoped they were reading the documentation. By the following morning, 2 days after my last day, the situation had escalated past the point of quiet patches. I learned the shape of it through Wesley, who sent a brief update. The scheduling cascade that had started Thursday afternoon had not been resolved overnight. The batch processing restart had not executed correctly. By Friday morning the logistics dashboard had frozen in a partial state, some modules updating, others stalled, that the IT team was struggling to diagnose because the behavior did not match any known error pattern in their documentation. Which was accurate. The pattern did not exist in the official error documentation because I had identified it during the system rebuild and addressed it through a calibration procedure I designed. That procedure was in my monitoring guide under a section heading I had specifically flagged in the handover notes. The flag was in the document. The document existed. Whether anyone had read to that section was a different question. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the particular tiredness of watching a preventable thing fail to be prevented. The system was not broken. It was behaving exactly the way I had documented it would behave under these conditions. That documentation was now the most important thing in the building. The IT team spent most of Friday searching for a bug that did not exist. Wesley kept me loosely informed, not through any coordinated effort, just because he was watching from the warehouse floor and needed someone who understood the system to talk to. He described the situation. Material releases were still delayed. The afternoon delivery schedule was going to be impacted. The team was manually tracking what the system should have been handling automatically. I asked him one question. Has anyone pulled up the monitoring guide in the shared drive? There's a section toward the back on cascade failure patterns. He said he would pass that on. An hour later he messaged back, IT found something. Looks like a procedure document. They're working through it. I thanked him and did not ask for more detail. The procedure was there. I had written it specifically because the cascade failure pattern was the most likely first serious problem after my departure, in language clear enough that someone who understood the system's basic architecture could work through it. Whether IT could apply it in time to save Friday's delivery schedule was a separate question. I suspected the answer was no. But the documentation existing was what mattered for what came next. By Monday morning, leadership was involved. The delivery delays from Friday had generated client complaints over the weekend. 2 manufacturing clients had escalated to account management, which had escalated to the VP. The VP pulled the department's operational records. Monitoring logs, incident reports, procedure documentation, everything sitting in the shared drive, time-stamped and organized. What those records showed, laid out in sequence, was a very clear picture. The system had been consistently monitored and maintained through daily checks and calibration procedures. The records of that maintenance went back 18 months. It had all been done by one person. That person was no longer employed. The records also showed something else. 3 separate written explanations, submitted over 2 years, describing the relationship between the daily monitoring and the system's reliability. 3 explanations that had been acknowledged and not acted on. The author was no longer employed. There was one more document, Brian's email to the VP describing the role elimination, explaining that the system's automation made the position redundant. That email now sat beside 20 months of monitoring logs demonstrating that the position had been doing something the automation could not do. The contrast was not subtle. The formal review began on Wednesday of that week. The VP brought in 2 members from the internal operations audit team. They spent 3 days reviewing records before requesting interviews. Perry was interviewed first. He was honest. He described the transition process, the 2 weeks of briefings, the documentation he had received, and the limits of what 2 weeks could transfer. He was not blamed. He had done everything asked of him. Brian was interviewed second. I was not present, but I received a summary from Vera, who told me the review had gone in a direction Brian had not anticipated and that certain documentation had become the focus of significant attention. The documentation she meant was the written risk explanations I had submitted over 2 years. The ones describing, specifically and technically, the risks of reducing or eliminating the monitoring process. The ones Brian had responded to with variations of, "sounds good." Those emails now existed as a record of 2 things simultaneously. The risks had been communicated, and the decision-maker had dismissed them. The audit team requested my contact information from our. I provided it. I cooperated with the audit fully and honestly. I provided the auditors with the documentation I had maintained personally, the monitoring logs, the calibration records, the risk assessments. I answered every question as precisely and factually as I could. I did not editorialize or characterize Brian's decisions. I described what I had done, what I had documented, what I had communicated, and what the responses had been. The facts, laid out in sequence, did not require characterization. The audit team was experienced at this kind of review. What they were doing, methodically, was building a record that could be presented to leadership with confidence in its accuracy. I spent about 3 hours total across 2 sessions answering questions. By the end of the second session, the lead auditor, a calm woman named Phoebe who had been doing this work for 15 years, thanked me and said my documentation was unusually complete. I said I had always believed in thorough records. She smiled briefly and said that had become apparent. I drove home after the second session feeling something I did not expect. Not vindication, something more like settled sadness, the particular feeling of having been right about something you would have preferred to be wrong about. The system had failed. I had known it would. I had said so in writing. None of that made me feel good. The audit findings were delivered to the VP 3 weeks after the system failure. I was not present for that meeting and did not receive a copy of the report. But the sequence of events that followed was visible enough. Brian was placed on administrative leave within 2 days of the report. Vera sent me a brief message as a professional courtesy. The review had reached its conclusions, and the company was taking corrective action. Perry called to let me know. He sounded exhausted in a way that suggested the past 3 weeks had been difficult for him, which I understood completely. The VP's office asked whether I would be willing to consult short-term to help stabilize the system. I declined politely. I was already in conversation with another company, and returning in a consulting role would not have been appropriate when the situation requiring that consultation was the company's own decision to eliminate my position. I wished them well. I meant it. Brian's departure was announced to the department about 10 days after he was placed on leave. The announcement used the standard language. Organizational changes, new direction, gratitude for contributions. 12 months of maneuvering. One decision about a replaceable employee. Consequences that arrived exactly on schedule. The call from Farfield Systems came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the audit concluded. I had been in conversation with them through a professional contact for about 2 weeks, initial discussions about a systems operations leadership role they were developing. The timing felt significant but was essentially coincidental. What was not coincidental was that they had done their research. The hiring manager, a direct and practical woman named Adaze who had spent 20 years in operations, said something I have thought about since. We heard about what happened at your previous company, she said. We wanted to understand your perspective. I gave her my perspective. Factually, without dramatization. The same way I had described things to the auditors. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what you describe as a failure mode I have seen in 3 other organizations. The pattern is almost identical. And the person who saw it coming is always the same kind of person. I asked her what kind that was. She said, the kind who keeps records. The offer she made was a significant step forward, title, authority, and compensation reflecting what the role actually required. I accepted without negotiation. It was already right. 6 months later, the system I manage at Farfield runs the way a well-maintained system runs. Not dramatically. Not in ways that generate quarterly highlights. It runs the way things run when someone is paying attention. Smoothly, with occasional corrections that prevent occasional corrections from becoming failures. I do the morning checks here too. They take about 50 minutes now because the system is larger. Nobody has ever asked me to reduce them. When I described the process to a days in my first month, she said, that makes sense. Keep doing it. I think about Brian Keller sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. I think about what he actually saw when he looked at my role. A person at a computer running checks on a system that appeared to run fine. A salary on a spreadsheet that could be eliminated to produce a number useful to his promotion proposal. A word, replaceable, that he said out loud in a conference room because he believed it and because believing it was useful to him. He was not stupid. He was wrong in a specific way. He confused the absence of visible problems with the absence of someone preventing them. The system I managed didn't run itself. I ran it. 8 years of consistent attention, careful documentation, and pattern recognition that doesn't exist in any automation rule. Brian said I was replaceable. The audit report that ended his career was built almost entirely from the records I kept. That is not revenge. That is documentation.